Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. Today on the show, rewarding work in healthy communities. Time and again, that's what we hear that people want. And that's just what most don't have in the USA today. As Thomas Piketty in his surprise bestseller, Capital in the 21st Century, has driven home, we live in a nation where the richest 0.1%, those with 20 million or more, have doubled their share of our nation's wealth since the 1960s. And as that wealth compounds in the financial market, so does the poverty of others. And the growing gap is tearing our society apart. Now, here at our program, we see many people who believe in the potential of worker-owned cooperatives, where every worker has an equal voice and a share in the company's profits. We've heard that co-ops give worker owners a way to have more say, and sometimes more income and more stability in their communities. But we've also heard concerns. Can small democratic co-ops end poverty? Probably not. Can bigger ones survive the pressures of the market? Finally, can co-ops that do survive in the market change society if instead of challenging the system, they're just operating within it? Our next guest, Chris Mackin, the founder and owner of Ownership Associates, doesn't necessarily think the market is the problem. For almost 40 years, he's been advising workers, owners, and unions on how workers can become owners of their own businesses. Chris, welcome to the program. Glad to have you.
Good to be here.
So let's first talk about how you got into this. It was early days to be thinking about democratic ownership in business in the 70s, right?
1977. Yes, I was a graduate student who was interested in ideas of democracy. I was actually an early school reform person involved in democratic schools. But as I sort of studied history and the people I was meeting, I became convinced that the problems of our economy are upstream from the schools and exist in terms of the economy and economic structures. And so I got interested in ideas for bringing democracy to the economy.
And what did you study? I mean, you were at Harvard at that point. I think you even wrote your dissertation on this topic.
Yes, I did. I got a doctorate in human development from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I wrote a thesis called The Social Psychology of Ownership, a case study of a democratically owned firm. I followed a worker-owned cooperative construction company that had converted to worker ownership and was gracious enough to let me in to sort of chronicle what went on there.
And what did go on there? How did they fare?
Well, they fared well for some period of time. In fact, it was an example of one of the things I hope we could talk about the promise of conversions of established businesses to worker ownership, which in many ways could be easier than startup businesses. And this was a conversion of a founding owner decided he wanted to move on and do something different, and he sold to the employees, and it worked very well.
You talk about 4 verbs of democratizing ownership.
People really do sort of get access to this idea in very different ways. I mean, some have first tuned into it because of the courageous story of the workers in Argentina and some courageous stories here in the United States where workers are literally taken over businesses, have expropriated them.
We've covered the New Era windows.
New Era windows is
of
that ilk, and it was inspired in part by what went on in Argentina. That will happen every now and then, but that's not a very frequent starting point for worker ownership. The second verb I talk about is to start, and that is the idea of cooperatives is really essential to that. And Mondragon is the big inspiration. Emilia-Romagna in Italy, some groups in Quebec have also done some important work. That's another starting point for this idea, to start. The third verb I talk about is to negotiate, where workers, usually through their unions, have negotiated ownership in exchange for some kind of contract change or contract concession, often in distress situations in the airline industry, in the steel industry and the like, and I have a fair amount of experience with that. And the fourth verb is to buy, is when workers as a group form themselves as a legal trust, an employee stock ownership trust, and literally buy a business, usually a healthy business, from a departing owner.
So what do you think makes a company ripe for a negotiated buyout by the workers?
I mean, the first is economic viability, and the second is time. I mean, there has to be time to work out the details and the terms and the governance arrangements, but the business has to be sound. and the motives of the sellers have to be reasonably positive, and there has to be trust.
What do you think of today's enthusiasm for worker-owned co-ops? It's a subject that has been getting infinitely more attention in the last 5 years than the 5 that preceded. The U.S. Federation of Worker-Owned Co-ops just had the conference, the 10th annual conference. They had more people there than ever. They said 500 in attendance.
No, that's wonderful. I came out of that movement myself. I still do some work in that sector. I'm a little bit more focused again on not just on startups, which is a lot of what that world is about. And, I tell those people in a as friendly way as possible that it took Mondragon 56 years to get where they are today. And I want to get something done in my lifetime and in the years ahead, and I think we need to be looking at a diversified strategy. And at healthy businesses where baby boomers are reaching retirement age and have got to sell. And if they can sell and use a cooperative structure, if that's what's compelling, that's great. But there are other structures that are in some ways easier to negotiate with, with banks and so forth, that can be made as democratic as a cooperative.
Let's take a look at a video, a trailer for a documentary called We the Owners that talks about this sector, a sector of corporations that are employing between 100 and 40,000 workers, worker owners through something called an ESOP. What is that?
An ESOP is an employee stock ownership plan, actually most appropriately known as an employee stock ownership trust, because the legal trust represents all employees, and it accomplishes the thing which seems most impossible to people. How can workers who have no money buy a business? They can do that by being organized as members of this trust, and they go to the bank and borrow money to be able to buy out companies. There are 10,000 of these companies that employ about 11 million workers around the country. And it's been in federal law since 1974.
All right, so we'll take a look at the film and then come back and talk about it.
Very good.
My name is Michael Miller. I go by Miller at the brewery. I'm 37 years old. I work for a New Belgium brewing company. I treat my job like it's my own business.
We believe in ownership in the United States. We believe in individual responsibility. And we want people to own the things that are core to their existence. But somehow or other we forgot to extend that to the workplace.
My name is Carlos Crabtree. I work as a project executive at DPR Construction.
DPR Construction is a national builder focused on primarily technical market sectors.
We talked a little bit about the culture and how it would operate, that it would be innovative and different from the traditional construction company.
My name's Wade Andrews. I'm a co-owner of Namaste Solar and also a residential lead installer.
Everything is interconnected, everything is interdependent, and that's really the approach that we bring to our business, that the community, the economy, the environment, they are all connected.
The whole thrust of science is to make the capital worker endlessly and progressively more productive.
The combination of open book management, employee ownership, and what we call high involvement culture, that's an incredibly powerful thing.
Because I'm an owner in New Belgium and there's open book management, and I'm able to do this and do a $500,000 transaction.
There's a company that's featured in their New Belgium Brewing Company. Kim Jordan's wonderful woman who, with her husband, founded this business, has reached she's a young and vital, probably in her late 50s or something, but did some advanced planning and looking down the road and did not want to sell to one of the big beer companies, that wanted to keep it independent, wanted to keep that legacy alive, and she has proceeded to sell internally to her employees through using this ESOP structure. It's about, I think she has about 350 employees, and they are setting up a whole new operation in Asheville, North Carolina. They're reproducing what they've done in Fort Collins, Colorado, and doing it in North Carolina. It's an example of, again, there are lots of these baby boomer owned businesses where the owners do wish to cash out. They want to retire, they want to get rewarded for what they've done, but they are not necessarily looking for the last buck, for the highest buck. They will sell internally for a market price to an ESOP trust representing their employees. They will get tax advantages for doing so, and the jobs are saved.
I just look back to the history of the U.S. after the Revolutionary War, where you had workers in, I think it was the cod industry.
Yeah.
Cod fishing ships have been used as part of the Navy in the war, resisting a government plan. The government plan had been to stimulate the industry by giving a stimulus, in a sense, to the owners. And the workers had the power to say, no, wait a minute, we want to go back to the pre-revolutionary time when we got a share of what came to these companies, and they got, I think, 60% of that at the end.
That's right, that's right. Now, these values are very old, and that is, in fact, probably the most optimistic fact in terms of looking at the future of this idea, is looking at the history of this idea.
So tell us some
more. Is that this idea existed, this idea came into the American scene with the earliest labor movement, with the Knights of Labor and the National Labor Union. These are pre-AFL-CIO organizations. This is 19th century. This is early to mid-19th century. This is as industrialization was just coming to town. And these people whose parents and grandparents had fought in the Revolutionary War thought of themselves as Republicans in the sense that they had fought for a republic. They were asking the question that if industry is here to stay, if the steam engine is here to stay, then why aren't these businesses that we're going to get set up organized on the same Republican, democratic value set of what we've just fought a war for? And those values, I think, are very deep in American culture. They're values in part of collective self-reliance and self-help, and they haven't gone away. It's before a lot of the left movements got started in the United States. I mean, this is 1820, 1840. You know, Karl Marx was a young man. You know, he hadn't written anything yet. So there were ideas that were out there and in circulation, these ideas of people, let's do this together ourselves, that weren't dependent on complex left ideologies. I'm left myself, but we don't have to pass these ideas through that lens.
Well, you raised Marx, and I mentioned Thomas Piketty at the beginning. Their teachings and the analysis, at least, that Piketty would say that he's brought, because he doesn't think it's an ideology, but an analysis,
right,
is of a system that is necessarily going to produce the kind of compounding wealth that we see reflected in Piketty's numbers, and necessarily, of course, then also poverty. You disagree, clearly.
Well, I disagree with Piketty's solutions. I mean, I think his analysis is very useful, but the solutions, if capital is winning this race against labor, if you know, and it is, then one question we might ask is, how do we include more people in capital, and not just look at engineering the wage side of the equation? And we needn't restrict ourselves to the workplace. That's a very important one. We should be looking at sky trusts that give citizens ownership stakes, the Alaska Permanent Fund. We should be looking at ownership of sports teams by communities. We should be looking, but the workplace is a pretty fundamental part of that. And you know, we can take care of the concerns that people have about diversification. We want people to not have their entire retirement based in their place of work, so we can have outside retirement plans for them while they own their businesses. That's one traditional concern that mainstream people bring to this idea. But at the end of the day, you know, the only way you're going to bridge this capital-labor gap, I think, is to include more people in capital structures.
So with respect to the criticism that this is a system that is built on extracting profits from workers to the disadvantage of the workers, you think there's some wiggle room there?
It's a question of who's the profit going to. And the profit is going to the wrong people. The profit is going to speculators. The profit's going to rentiers, whatever. It's going to people who are betting on horses. It's not going to the people who are actually making the profit. John Stuart Mill, you know, used to talk about competition as a friendly rivalry, and profits as a measure of what is happening in terms of the performance of firms. I mean, I think, you know, I believe in, you know, a regulated economy. I believe that even in a future world of worker-owned businesses, we still need a state that is making sure that things are being done fairly. But I don't see markets as the problem. I see the ownership structures as the problem.
Why doesn't the Alaska Fund get more attention? Alaska Fund that's been embraced by Republicans, Democrats, left, right, all together. It looks a whole lot like a nationalized industry with sort of socialized benefits to me.
Sarah Palin even liked it. That's right. Now those sorts of ideas need to be looked at, and as well as community ownership of sports teams and other ways of getting this idea of broader capital participation and circulation. People need to have forms of wealth building apart from what's their paycheck. Yeah. We need to get that, whether that's at the community level as well as at the workplace.
I should say the Alaska Fund is the system by which all Alaskans benefit from the oil drilled on their state.
That's right. They get part of the royalties, yes. Mm-hmm.
Chris, thank you so much.